Welcome to Mind, Muscle, and Metabolism, the Jade Teta podcast. Here you get the in-depth science and practical tools needed to change your body, optimize your health, and elevate your mindset. I'm Dr. Jade Teta, and here is what I want you to know. You are different. You are as unique on the inside chemically as you are on the outside physically. And those differences matter. They matter because there is only one rule to achieving optimal health, fitness, and body change. That rule: do what works for you. My goal is to help you understand exactly how. I'm so excited you're here. Your transformation starts right now. All right, peeps, it's episode number 2 of the Jade Teta podcast. And today I had one thing planned, and then I'm going to switch it up a little bit. I plan on talking about the 5 laws of metabolism, but I've been getting so many questions about the menstrual cycle and training with the menstrual cycle that I thought I would cover that first here, just because it's something that's a huge topic that many women want to understand. So the first thing we're going to do is cover the menstrual cycle in depth, and I always laugh at this. It is incredibly comical to me that if you look at me, I'm this big, bald, huge NFL linebacker-looking dude and look about as masculine as they come. And yet I'm an expert in female metabolism and the menstrual cycle, and that is funny to me, and it's probably funny to you women who are listening. The story behind that actually is just that, I'm a very conscientious practitioner, and I've been working with mostly women my entire career in personal training and in medicine. And you just learn, and you make sure that you're going to get your clients and patients results. And so I had to learn this stuff. So I become an expert in this, and that's mostly what I've done, actually. Mostly what I'm known for is being an expert in the female metabolism. You're going to get some of that expertise today. So let's just, to make sure that we're all on the same page, let's go through the menstrual cycle first before we could talk about the advantages and disadvantages of scheduling your diet and your exercise around the menstrual cycle. The first thing to know is that the menstrual cycle is different for every single woman, but in the textbooks, they typically give a specific or a menstrual cycle that is typical. And as all women know, there's no such thing as a typical menstrual cycle or a typical woman, but it's helpful in the education of this. So the typical menstrual cycle, as defined in the textbooks, is 28 days, okay? 28 days long. Now, obviously, some women will be shorter than that, some longer. The first day, day 1, is considered the first day of bleeding. And so that's when you actually begin to bleed and the lining of the uterus begins to shed. So that's day 1. Now, at that point in time, the hormones, estrogen and progesterone, have just fallen off pretty abruptly and they are low. Okay? What happens at that point is, under direction from the hypothalamus, which is the command and control center of the metabolism, and its communication center, the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus speaks to the pituitary gland, which speaks to then the ovaries, and the ovaries, under the influence of primarily follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, are going to begin to mature the follicle. And during that time, the follicle starts to produce estrogen. And obviously, the follicle is what contains the egg. Okay, so you can kind of think about this growing follicle. As it grows over the first 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle, it begins to secrete more and more estrogen. And so estrogen levels rise during this first part of the menstrual cycle. We call it the follicular phase. And it's called the follicular phase because the follicle is developing during this first 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle. Okay. Now, during this time, estrogen is going up. It's relatively low the first week during menses, and then it goes pretty high the second week. Okay. And during this time also, progesterone is low. As a matter of fact, women typically have about the same amount of progesterone in their blood as men might during this follicular phase. So it's a time where estrogen is high and progesterone is low, relatively speaking. Okay. So that's important to know. Now, we also can divide the follicular phase up into early follicular phase and late follicular phase. So early follicular phase is basically during menses, right? While you're bleeding. It's the first 7 days of the cycle. At this time, estrogen is low to moderate and progesterone is low. And then in the late follicular phase, estrogen is high and progesterone is low. okay? Now what happens at this point is there is a surge in another hormone that's stimulated through the hypothalamus and pituitary called luteinizing hormone, LH. LH will then have this sort of spike, and this LH spike signals the follicle to rupture and release the egg. And at that point in time, once the egg releases from the follicle now becomes the corpus luteum. This is ovulation. And so ovulation is around 14 days in this typical 28-day cycle. So you have the first 14 days, and you have the follicle developing under follicle stimulating hormone with estrogen rising and progesterone low. And then you have ovulation under this luteinizing hormone surge. The egg is released, and now that follicle turns into the corpus luteum. And that's what we call the second phase of the menstrual cycle, the luteal phase, because of the formation of this corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum begins to secrete and become the source of progesterone. So in the early luteal phase, the first week after ovulation, you have high progesterone and rising pretty fast progesterone levels. And then in the week after that, the late luteal phase, you have higher progesterone than estrogen, but both of these falling off pretty quickly, and then menses happens. Unless, of course, the egg gets fertilized, in which case the corpus luteum will be around for a little while, but then the placenta and will become the source of the hormones to maintain pregnancy, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. Just to reiterate, there's the follicular phase, first 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle, then there's ovulation at day 14, and then there's the luteal phase, the next 2 weeks of the cycle, and then the whole process starts over again. Now, a couple things to keep in mind here. We can look at the menstrual cycle in two ways. We can just look at it as a follicular phase and a luteal phase, where the follicular phase has estrogen high, progesterone low, and we can have look at it from the luteal phase, second part, luteal phase, where progesterone and estrogen are both high, but progesterone's a little bit higher. And so the ratio of estrogen to progesterone can make a difference here. Now, we also can look at the menstrual cycle in 4 phases. Early follicular phase, where estrogen is rising, progesterone is low. Late follicular phase, where estrogen is high, progesterone is low. Early luteal phase, where estrogen is high and progesterone is rising, and then late luteal phase, where progesterone is high and estrogen is falling, and then sort of right at the end there, they abruptly fall off and menses starts over again. You'll see why this is important in just a minute. So that hopefully explains the menstrual cycle, and you sort of understand that. Follicular phase, luteal phase, right? Estrogen, progesterone. These things are fluctuating throughout the menstrual cycle. Now, one caveat here is really interesting, right? If you are on hormone replacement therapy in terms of oral contraceptive pills or a hormone secreting IUD like Mirena or something like that, or a patch or anything like that that's giving you hormones for birth control or symptom management of menstrual symptoms, that is going to be very different, okay? Here's the thing that you need to understand about that. When you are naturally hormonal and your hormones are regulating naturally, it fluctuates, right? You saw, I just described how estrogen and progesterone sort of jump around in this nice cyclical manner. Well, usually with hormone replacement therapy, oral contraceptive pills, or hormone secreting IUDs and things like that, there is a steady amount of hormone in the system. Okay, and then that is very different than the natural rhythm, which may or may not have consequences and may or may not be a good thing. But it's just useful to understand how this works. So you might wonder, well, how come I get menses then when I'm on oral contraceptives? Because the last 7 days or 4 days or 3 days, depending on the pill, will be placebo pills. And so they mimic what happens with these hormones that fall off at the end of a menstrual cycle. So that's why that happens. Some women don't want their period, and so they don't have those placebo pills. So hopefully that makes some sense there. Now let's cover what estrogen and progesterone do for women in terms of fat loss. Now, estrogen is very misunderstood. misunderstood because a lot of times people think it is a fat storing hormone. It actually isn't. It is globally fat burning, primarily because it actually has some insulin sensitizing effects. It speeds up metabolic processes a little bit. It has some weak anabolic properties, very much like testosterone, and it allows women to burn more fat as a relative percentage at all exercise intensities compared to men. Estrogen is also a cortisol antagonist, so it helps with lowering stress. And so anytime estrogen is elevated for a woman, that's going to be a prime time for her to both build muscle and burn some fat and be less stress sensitive. So you can see that at times when estrogen is high or unopposed by progesterone, this is a nice time where a woman can maybe tolerate more food and more exercise, meaning, being able to not store fat as readily under a calorie excess and burn fat more readily under a calorie deficit, and also be able to handle more exercise stress when estrogen is sort of dominating. So that's pretty cool, right? Now, the question is, but Jade, I've heard that estrogen is a fat storing hormone. Where does that come from? Well, certain areas of the female body are loaded with, the fat tissue is loaded with what's called alpha receptors. And these alpha receptors, you can remember there's two types of receptors associated with fat tissue, beta receptors and alpha receptors. These receptors are bound by the fat burning hormones, the catecholamines, adrenaline, noradrenaline, this kind of thing. Now, to remember this and keep this in mind, alpha, think A for alpha, anti-burn. Think B for beta, burn. Okay, so the proportions of these receptors in the fat tissue can determine how fast that fat tissue is lost or how stubborn that fat tissue is. So in the case of estrogen, estrogen amplifies the activity of alpha receptors, making it more likely that women will store fat around the hips, butt, thighs, and breast, areas that concentrate these alpha receptors, which is a good thing, right? Because that's what gives women that beautiful, beautiful hourglass shape that we all love, that lights up our brains. When a man sees a woman's physique, it lights up our brain centers. That's what's doing that. So while estrogen helps burn fat globally, it does also make fat gain and fat gain more easily and fat loss more difficult at certain areas, the hips, butt, thighs, breast, right? So that's really important. So it gives women that hourglass shape. Now, progesterone. What does progesterone do? Well, progesterone antagonizes much of what estrogen does. So when more progesterone's around, you're a little bit more insulin resistant. The metabolism isn't as ramped up as it might be with estrogen. But progesterone does have some very nice anti-cortisol, anti-stress effects as well. So when progesterone is around, you may want to ease up a little bit. You may be a little bit more stress reactive because you'd be better off having both estrogen and progesterone together, right, to help buffer against stress. And you may be more insulin resistant, so less likely to be able to tolerate more carbohydrates and more calories in general. And so now this picture starts to emerge. We talked about the idea that in the follicular phase, there's more estrogen around, at least in terms of a relative perspective. The highest estrogen times would be when? Late follicular phase and early luteal phase, right? But the times where estrogen is most unopposed by progesterone would be the follicular phase itself, the first 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle. Now, I know this gets confusing, so you may want to listen to it over and over again, and I'll repeat it a couple times. But the reason I'm going through this is because this slight variation in looking at the menstrual cycle, whether you look at it in 2 phases, follicular versus luteal, or whether you look at it in 4 phases, early follicular, late follicular, early luteal, late luteal, may determine how you approach the menstrual cycle training, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. So let's just recap real quick because I know this is some very advanced biochemistry, and I know all of you are not biochemists. So once again, the follicular phase, first 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle. The luteal phase, the second 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle. Ovulation breaks those two up. Without the formation of the corpus luteum, without ovulation, there is no progesterone. Follicular phase, more estrogen relative to progesterone. Luteal phase, more progesterone relative to estrogen, right? Makes sense. So during the follicular phase, women should be able to train harder, eat more, and deal with life a little bit better because estrogen has those nice effects. During the luteal phase, especially the late luteal phase, they should have maybe a little bit more time and be less likely to be able to eat more, maybe want to eat less, and maybe be a little less likely to tolerate training stresses and things like that. So hopefully that begins to make sense to you now. So what we can begin to do is we can begin to take women and essentially say, listen, you may want to begin to structure your diet and exercise so that you are eating more and exercising more, what I like to refer to as an EM lifestyle or a more athletic training lifestyle during the first 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle, right, during the follicular phase. And then at ovulation, you can switch into a more relaxed type of approach where you're eating less and exercising less, right? What I call an EL phase, which is a traditional hunter-gatherer or traditional European Parisian type lifestyle. Not going crazy on the exercise, maybe walking a lot, of course, because you want to walk a lot all the time. We're built to walk, and that's what we need to do. So you have a nice base of walking during an EL, eat less, exercise less phase, but you're not crushing it in the gym, and you're decreasing your carbs and calories at that point in time so that you are not overstressing yourself at the gym and not overeating with the food. And this goes very nicely with the menstrual cycle, right? So if you know when you ovulate, some women do, some women don't. I've heard it described many different ways by women. I remember one time I said, when you ovulate, I've heard that you have this little tickle, near your ovaries. And the woman looked at me, she said, tickle, are you kidding me? It's the worst pain ever. Of course, I was like, well, what would I know? I'm just a dude. I've never gone through this before, but I've heard it described different ways. Some women will feel some pain, some aching. Some women will feel like a little tickle sensation. Some women don't know when they ovulate at all and feel nothing. Typically during the ovulation, you might see an uptick in libido, actually, and you've heard this over and over again clinically that libido seems to peak in most women right around ovulation and right around menses, which is really interesting, right? So you kind of have these peaks in libido as well. One other thing about the menstrual cycle, by the way, is at the end of the menstrual cycle, the last few days just before menses, estrogen and progesterone will drop pretty precipitously. And this is really, if you want to know what menopause feels like and you're a younger woman, you kind of go through a mini menopause every single month, right? You kind of go through this mini menopause where estrogen and progesterone fall away. And this is why you can get some emotional lability and, feeling anxious or depressed and those kinds of things, because there are receptors for estrogen and progesterone all over the body, including in the brain. And so just a precursor real quick, because I like this to be an advanced course, this podcast. Estrogen is primarily associated with serotonin and dopamine. Serotonin is largely considered the self-esteem brain chemical. It is a relaxant and sort of a feel-good brain chemical. Dopamine is sort of a motivating and focusing brain chemical. And so estrogen is associated with these two things. Progesterone is typically associated with GABA, which is the major relaxing brain chemical, which is why a lot of times people think progesterone is an anxiolytic, helps with anxiety. That's why women who are going through perimenopause, as progesterone falls away, can start getting anxious where they didn't have it before. It's also why sometimes women will feel fine during the first 2 weeks of their menstrual cycle, but start getting anxiety in the next 2 weeks if they are progesterone deficient and not having the formation of the corpus luteum or not producing enough progesterone. So those are just some tidbits there. How can you deal with that? Well, cocoa is very good in that. Cocoa powder, I talk about this a lot, not chocolate, because chocolate obviously has a lot of calories, sugar, and fat in it, and is a hedonistic, palatable food, which makes you crave more hedonistic, high-calorie foods. But cocoa powder, so taking cocoa powder, like the stuff you put in cakes, putting it in water, and stirring it up and drinking that. Cocoa powder has anandamide in it, which is a cannabinoid that relaxes the brain chemical. It's been called relaxes the brain. It's been called chemical bliss in some research. Calms you. Has phenylethylamine in it, PEA, which is the thing that will make your dog sick if they get a hold of chocolate. That's a dopamine mimicker, and it also raises serotonin. My brother Keone, who's an expert in this, I may have this right or wrong, but I think he told me, I don't know this off my head, but I think he told me that it has preformed serotonin actually in cocoa powder. I'll have to confirm that with him because he is one of the best experts probably in the world on cocoa powder. But we use this in our clinic all the time, right around menses, cocoa powder in water like coffee to stabilize brain chemistry. My company, Metabolic Effect, actually has a product called Craving Cocoa that we almost were going to call Menstrual Cocoa, but obviously that wouldn't go over too well. But Craving Cocoa was specifically designed for this. So if you're interested in that, you can check out metaboliceffect.com. Jumping in real quick to tell you about an exciting product you're probably going to be interested in, Craving Cocoa. Look, as you know, long-term success with body change boils down to being able to control the natural elevations in hunger and cravings. If you can't do that, you are not going to be successful because you cannot win a battle of the wills against your physiology. So Craving Cocoa is specifically designed to help you balance brain chemistry and shut off hunger and cravings. It is formulated with cocoa, special slippery fibers that coat the digestive system, tricking you into thinking you've eaten already, and amino acids which directly interact with hunger and craving centers in the brain to suppress your hunger and cravings. And of course, cocoa is the major ingredient. Phenylethylamine is in cocoa, which is a dopamine mimicker to help you feel motivated and focused. Serotonin is in cocoa to help you feel relaxed and joyful. And of course, anandamide, called in chemistry research chemical bliss, is also in cocoa to satisfy the brain. Craving Cocoa allows you to shut off hunger and cravings for only under 30 calories. It's amazing around the menstrual time, and it's amazing anytime you are dieting and suffering from hunger and cravings. If you're interested in seeing Craving Cocoa, what it can do for you, you can pick it up at metaboliceffect.com/product/craving-cocoa, or you can find it on Amazon.com at Craving Cocoa in the search bar. Thanks so much, you guys. Back to the show. You're now understanding how you can use the menstrual cycle. Now, here's one other caveat here, and you're probably going to want to listen to this podcast several times because what I'm going to tell you now complicates things a little bit further. But just to review where we are, estrogen tends to be the more anabolic, stress-reducing hormone that helps women feel more brain stable, helps with motivation and mood enhancement, allows women to eat a little bit more and exercise a little bit more and be more likely to get lean and build muscle while doing that versus when estrogen is lower. Now, when progesterone starts to dominate relative to estrogen, most of those estrogen effects are undone. So that's why you get this effect. You probably want to be stricter on your diet, or at least ease up and be in a less stressed state in the second half of the menstrual cycle, the luteal phase, and then train like crazy and eat a little bit more during the first half. And you should do very, very well with this. And if you know when you ovulate, you know exactly when to make that switch. Now, here's just a little caveat here. Obviously, if you know when you ovulate, you would follow an eat more, exercise more approach from the first day of bleeding up until when you ovulate. And then you'd follow the eat less, exercise less approach until you menstruate again, right? So, because not every menstrual cycle is going to be exactly 28 days. And so you can use it that way. So it won't always be 2 weeks and 2 weeks. So that's the way to do this when we're looking at the menstrual cycle just from the luteal and follicular phase. However, if you're trying to target specific areas, let's say you're a woman who is pear-shaped and wants to focus on losing lower body fat, hips, butt, and thighs. Well, now we have to look at this a little bit differently because now you want to attack the alpha receptor situation, right? You want to sort of deal with that situation. And so what happens is estrogen levels actually enhance alpha receptor activity, right? So at the times when estrogen is the highest, forget about progesterone now, but at the times when estrogen is the highest, those are going to be the times when it's going to be most difficult to burn off fat from those areas. However, at the times when estrogen is the lowest, it may be a good time to attack those specific body parts. So when is estrogen the lowest? Well, it's low, right? First week of the menstrual cycle. It's low early follicular phase, right? And it's low right at the end of the menstrual cycle as well, late luteal phase. So during the late luteal phase, the week before menses, and early follicular phase, the week of menses, is the time that estrogen is going to be the lowest. And that's the time where you can attack these specific alpha dense areas of the body as a woman. Now, it's tricky, right? Because these are also the times that it might be a little bit more stressful for the system, and that's a little tricky to do. So that might be a time then where you could every once in a while move into an eat less, exercise more type of approach, or any approach that creates the sustained calorie deficit that you need while keeping you sane, right? While keeping you sane. And you can go back and listen to episode number 1 of this podcast to understand how to stay sane, how to create these calorie deficits without throwing yourself so out of balance. But the point here is that if you're trying to spot reduce, which really isn't possible when you think about it from a spot reduction point of view. In other words, you can't exercise the outer thighs and have an increased fat loss from the outer thighs. It just doesn't work like that. However, you can speed up fat loss from the areas that are slow to release their fat to make them more in line with fat loss from the rest of the body. Every woman who's got issues with pear shape and things like that knows the dilemma of losing weight and fat and seeing most of it come off the breast and the waist and the arms, right? Because the breasts don't necessarily in all women have as dense alpha receptors, but especially the arms and the waist get thin, right? But the hips and thighs don't. And so what happens is this woman who's a pear shape loses weight and goes from a bigger pear shape to a smaller but more pronounced pear shape. And this is because while you're burning fat all over the body, you're burning fat more slowly from the hips and thighs. I've even had women tell me, I swear that my hips and thighs are growing. It's just an illusion. It's just that they're losing fat at a slower rate compared to the rest of the body. So timing your calorie deficits and your exercise in line when estrogen is low could be useful here. Now, I'll say one final thing. I don't like to go on and on in these podcasts, try to keep it short, but I will say one final thing here for menopause, because obviously this impacts the menstrual cycle. Menopause is really 3 different phases: perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause. At perimenopause, what begins to happen is ovulation starts not to occur because the follicle and the eggs are not maturing, or they're old, or they are not being stimulated adequately for many different reasons during the aging process. That's what basically begins to happen. So during perimenopause, what happens is you end up having a situation where estrogen begins to dominate and progesterone is low, because if you don't ovulate, what happens is you don't form the corpus luteum and estrogen is low. Another interesting thing about that is estrogen, in order for estrogen to do its job and get the right cycle, this is all built on a cycle, it does need some progesterone inputs. And so because it's not getting that, in the perimenopause, you'll see progesterone levels, sometimes they're high, sometimes they're low. They're very volatile. They're up and they're down. Estrogen levels and progesterone levels will be low. And so this is a very volatile time. And so during this time of the sort of menstrual cycle for women, our life cycle for women, what they may want to do is be focusing on relaxing. They're very stress sensitive at this time because estrogen can be so volatile and all over the place. So it's not high like we would want it in stabilizing the brain chemistry. Actually, it's all over the place, jumping up and down and high and low, and progesterone is low. So this is a time to really begin to watch your food intake, to reduce stress, to take a lot of long walks, to not try to ramp up and do more in the exercise realm. That can make things worse. As you progress into menopause, what happens is now estrogen falls along with progesterone. So now they're both low, which symptom-wise makes things easy for women. But this is when you start to see a spread of weight around the middle. Belly fat starts to grow here because estrogen and progesterone are both anti-cortisol hormones. And as they fall, the belly fat starts to get bigger. And that's when you have to start really, again, focusing on stress reduction. And so menopause is really a time when stress becomes one of the major contributing factors to the inability to lose weight or the fact that you're gaining weight. It's not diet and exercise so much anymore. It's more stress management. Then, of course, at postmenopause, it's tricky because at postmenopause, what happens is the ovaries produce estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. What some studies suggest is that while the ovaries will stop producing estrogen and progesterone, sometimes in some women, you'll see that the ovaries continue to produce testosterone at the same rates that they once did. So all of a sudden, these women start to have more testosterone, relatively speaking, not from an absolute perspective, but relatively speaking, from estrogen and progesterone. And even if estrogen and progesterone and testosterone fall, it's oftentimes still the fact that you have a higher now proportion of testosterone compared to estrogen and progesterone than you ever have before as a postmenopausal woman. And this is why, you'll start seeing as men and women age, women start looking a little bit more like men as they age, and women, same thing. They start losing their testosterone and start getting more estrogen exposure. They start looking a little bit more like women. And so what you want to begin doing at menopause, both perimenopause and postmenopause, is understand these changes and understand that the biggest thing that you can do as a menopausal woman is start to really look after your stress management, which really, what are the two best things for stress? Really, well, sleep and naps and things like that, sure, but walking too. Walking is amazing because it's the only form of activity that actually sensitizes the whole body to insulin and lowers cortisol. And so walking should become the dominant form of activity. And obviously, you have to watch your calorie intake as well. So that's it for today's podcast on the menstrual cycle. This was obviously loaded with some in-depth hormonal chemistry and all of that kind of stuff. So you may want to listen to it over and over again, but I hope that is beneficial for you. And I will see you at the next podcast. Pop it in real quick just to say thank you so much for your interest and support of the JadeTeta.com podcast. I am bringing back by popular demand the live Q&A calls I used to do back in the day, where you can get on live with me, ask your question directly, and have me answer it in full. Questions about thyroid and adrenal health, autoimmune disease, any health condition, belly fat, muscle building, performance enhancement, you name it, we are going to cover it on the Q&A podcast. If you'd like to be on these live Q&A calls with me and speak to me directly, all you need to do is become a patron of the podcast. You can go to www.patreon.com/Jade Teta. That's www.patreon.com/Jade Teta. Become a patron of the podcast. I would greatly appreciate your support, and you'll be able to access me live to answer all your questions in depth. Thanks again for your support. See you on the podcast.